Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us in the world. Welcome to today's webinar, DevOps Best Practices, Managing and Scaling Release Automation in the Enterprise Using Visual and Code-Centric Methods. Before we begin, I have a few simple housekeeping items to go through. This webinar is being recorded. Links to the slides and the recording will be made available to you after the presentation is over. And we encourage you to post your questions via the GoToWebinar control panel that you see to your right. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce my two speakers for today, Tim Buntel, VP of Products for Exebia Labs, along with Vincent Partington, CTO and co-founder of Exebia Labs.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. This is Tim Buntel, joining Vincent here on the call with you today. We're really glad you took the time to join us for the conversation. Have a lot of interesting information to share with you based on some of our experiences working with lots of companies over numerous years now, as we've seen organizations tackle some of the challenges in DevOps and the enterprise scale. Today, at a high level, we're going to speak a little bit about release pipeline orchestration, as that's somewhat of a newer part of the DevOps solution among other automation techniques. But then really what we want to do is talk about this notion of dual mode enterprises and this notion of low code or no code versus code-centric or hybrid environments, and some of the ways that organizations can successfully leverage the mixtures that exist in their organization, automated events and manual events, code-centric and non-code-centric folks, to really scale their ability to deliver the value that DevOps promises at scale. We're going to spend a good amount of time on a demonstration. Here we'll use some of our software and some other software that you'll be familiar with, primarily Jenkins, to talk about some of the ways that you can employ these tactics to scale your own DevOps initiatives. And then we'll have plenty of time at the end for some questions and conversation and discussion. Feel free to type those in to the chat window using the GoToMeeting control panel there as we go along. All right, so we're going to start off, before we get going, with a quick survey question. If we launch that survey question, just to kind of get a sense of where folks are in their own process today. So let us know kind of in your organization where you consider yourself in your own DevOps journey or your own DevOps process. So we'll give a few seconds for folks to pick what matches most closely. Okay, how are we looking, Eunice? We got a good number of responses there. All right, so this is great. It seems to me like we've got a good number of folks who are kind of in the early stage. This leading category is this kind of some early successes, but more needed. So I think this is right in line with what we see. In the early stages, there's plenty of tools and information out there about how to get started, but this notion of what do you do once you get the ball rolling to really make that leap into the advanced stage, I think is great. So good to know. I think that we'll be able to tailor the content pretty well to that today. So want to talk a little bit about kind of the theory and realities that we face, right? So if you look at kind of the notion of DevOps and this pipeline and the tool chain, one of the places where we start, the sort of conceptual destination that you're going to, is really around this fully automated pipeline, where developer checks in code, the build, the integration, the testing, provisioning new environments, deploying to those environments, and then actually standing everything up and getting it running is fully automated. And we've seen over the years that technology, the products have come along that help you string this kind of process together to build these pieces and automate that pipeline. in very kind of isolated, early stage applications or greenfield environments, this might actually be a realistic scenario. You might be able to put this together and be able to have this constant flow going on. But in reality, what we tend to see in organizations is really a much more complicated world. Where if you look at the things that come into play in the process of making a decision to add a change to software, all the way through when that change gets made available to the users, and when that value gets expressed to the users, there's a lot of other things that are happening in there. And in many cases, the things that are happening are coming from different parts of the process. They are manual operations where other people have to get involved, or from third-party systems or external processes. So security is a very commonly cited one. It might be automated security tasks, but there might be third-party security tasks, pen testing or other reviews and audits. Compliance often has to be involved, making sure that certain procedures and operations are being carried out. Then there's a whole host of participants who are not really in that code part of the process at all. Here at Xebia Labs, we're a software company, so as we're using these tools and techniques on our own to build and release our own software, there's lots of other players that get involved. Marketing has to prepare content for a launch. Program management might be coordinating with other products or vendors or third parties. And then finally, there's kind of the business owners who are interested in measuring the impact of those changes, right? So regardless of the type of company that you are, in a large enterprise, a software company, it doesn't matter, this kind of vision of a fully automated pipeline that just kind of sets and goes, in many cases is a bit too simplistic. Right? And we find that the DevOps world actually gets much more complex. This specifically applies to the broader piece, right? Small parts can be fully automated, but it gets even more complex as you have broader kind of view over the entire release process. So what do organizations do? Well, they end up with these kind of highly disjointed efforts to pull that all together. I think we're probably all familiar with a lot of these stages here. Talk to fairly sophisticated organizations who've managed to automate deployment or provisioning, and yet it's not uncommon to still have some sort of spreadsheets and emails, people saying, hey, where are we with this release? Are we ready to go? Checking dependencies on releases in an informal process. We end up trying to keep ahead of the information as it changes on a regular basis through things like daily stand-up meetings, right? Hey, what's going on in the process right now? Where are you with that release? Are you holding up my release because I have a dependency on something that you're doing? Status and tracking down issues gets to be problematic when someone needs to find out from another person who holds that information what's a potential risk to the process. And then finally, you sort of face a lot of issues when it comes to compliance, auditing, regulatory needs, understanding who did what and when. Individual systems can capture this information, but it becomes very difficult when you need to have an overall view of that. So even if we're automating small pieces, all of these other intermingling parts result in today what is really a chaotic release process, even in organizations that are fairly mature with some of the automation technologies. When we look at the landscape, it also doesn't help that most organizations are using just a wild range of different tools, all of which are really good at specific things, but that don't kind of sit together in a really well-organized way. So as software is moving from the planning phase into development, building, testing, the constant looping of deployment and provisioning that happens as you're moving from different environments, and the testing that applies to each of those to make sure that you're not suffering from configuration drift or other problems that happen as you move from environment to environment, all the way up through actually deploying, releasing, and then monitoring, and then the feedback loop to that. Today, it's not uncommon for software organizations to have dozens of different technologies that all link together to make that process. But there's frequently not a good way to kind of manage those all and have that visibility across the entire process. So that's one of the things that ZBA Labs focuses on. We'll come back to this a little bit later when we go into the demo. But the idea here is that if you're performing DevOps at scale in an organization where you're operating with a number of these systems, you really need something in the same way that an orchestra conductor gets all of the individual expert musicians to work together in a coherent whole. We need pipeline orchestration to make sure all of these individual best-of-breed solutions can work together across that whole pipeline, give you the visibility, give you the management, the reporting, the auditing functionality, and then also to deploy the individual parts of that. So we looked at that process of moving your application from environment to environment, that deployment automation challenge, as another specific area where there was a need for a lot of opportunity to scale that with a model-driven approach, and that's what the XLD product is all about. Again, when we get into a demo in a moment, we'll take a look at how those two products specifically will help with this, but I think what you'll find is the conversation that we're going to have today are really generally applicable no matter what your combination of products in your environment is. So once we're kind of thinking about orchestrating the releases, we really kind of think about scale as part of this process of maturing DevOps or CD in your enterprise. What we kind of see typically in that first stage is really the individual needs of dev and ops to put the process together in the first place. So this is dealing with the kind of nuts and bolts of getting a DevOps process in place. So automating specific processes, making them repeatable, making them able to run quickly with fewer errors. Now, once an organization kind of masters those basics, those are typically on the individual project or department level. The next step to scaling that is to start really thinking about how does this fit beyond my team into the broader enterprise. So this we typically see as kind of the second phase of DevOps, where you're starting to look at things like how do integrations across multiple systems happen? When you're building a solution that includes a front end and then maybe a back end payment system, how does that change your process? What are some of the broader enterprise issues that come up around compliance, regulatory adherence, or auditing requirements, and then security and scale, right? Once we've put these processes in place, how do we roll it out to dozens, or in some of the customers we work with, hundreds of development teams across an organization, all needing to do this. And then really the kind of third stage, once you've built that automation and the nuts and bolts, you've rolled it out to the enterprise in a repeatable format, you've built the required regulatory and auditing controls around that, only then can you really start to reap the benefits that DevOps promises around the insight that you get from this, right? The intelligence that comes from your DevOps process. That's where things like visibility and analytics starts to come in. Where are the bottlenecks in my process? What do I want to do to improve so that I get better in the future? And then finally closing the loop with your end users, right? To see how does that change that I put into production actually impact the business value, right? Are users happier, right? So no matter where you are in your process of rolling this out, you're probably struggling at various points along this process. It's not just a linear, you finish everything in bucket one and then move to bucket two. And what we'll often see is folks will get some success with early automation efforts, and they start to get some repeatable processes, but they quickly will hit that scaling wall, right? How do you start to roll this out? How do you take advantage of the people who are required to get this implemented across the enterprise? So before I get into a couple of the factors that we've found can really be helpful when you're looking to scale in this way, I'm going to ask another quick survey question just to get feedback from folks on the call. So if you are in this process, if you haven't yet gotten started with DevOps at all, don't worry. But for those of you who are, often there's these code artifacts that are part of that DevOps process. Um, in your organization, who's really responsible for creating and maintaining those artifacts? So we'll give you a second to answer that question. Okay, it looks like we've got most of the answers there. Okay, good. So this seems to be a decent split between both being responsible and developers being responsible, with only a very small number putting that in operations. So I think this is really good and interesting, and kind of a nice lead-in to kind of the first piece um, of the model that we want to talk about today, which are kind of skills and skill sets. So in general, we see kind of two big factors for scaling when it comes to code-centric and non-code-centric things, right? The first part is based on the skill sets, right? So what are the kind of range of skills of the people that are participating in your DevOps process? And it's not surprising that operations was picked in the survey is very low for impacting or being responsible for the code-centric things, because generally, while dev and ops equally create the term DevOps, those tend to be not really code-centric folks. So you have to think about who's able to do the work, who has the skills required for doing different kinds of work in order to achieve scale. The second part is this notion of kind of triggering. So what drives the work? What are the sort of ways that work gets initiated, and to be able to respond to those appropriately and at scale. So we're going to drill into both of those in a little bit more detail, talk about kind of who does what and when, and then see how you can start to mix and match technologies to be able to make the appropriate combination. And ultimately, we can achieve scale by making sure that we respond to the right kinds of triggers with the right kinds of people who have the right skill sets to do the work. Right? That'll allow us to achieve scale across the enterprise. So let's start with this notion of skill sets and kind of who's able to do the work. Generally, we find kind of two approaches, two modes to operating in DevOps based on these different tool sets. So there's the kind of GUI-centric and a sort of code-centric approach to it. GUI-centric, as the name implies, this is using some sort of graphical tool to model and execute the parts of the DevOps process. Could be a combination of tools here, but the primary idea is that you're visually representing what you do, and then you're actually using the tool as well to monitor, look for problems, assign responsibility to certain tasks and so forth. Typically, we see this used by the kinds of operations folks that were probably indicated in the survey, but also all of those other people in the software process who are less code-centric or less kind of technically advanced. So this could be release managers who are looking at multiple releases at the same time. They could be non-technical business owners or other parts of the process. I mentioned here marketing. We use our own tool to model the process, not only the technical bits, promoting a build from staging to production, but also to orchestrate all of the processes around it, writing a press release when the release gets moved into production, or updating the documentation. And then certainly risk and compliance is another participant that you're not going to be able to expect a compliance officer to go into a highly technical tool or go into log files or be writing scripts to make sure that certain things were adhered to. So there is definitely this focus on GUI-centric for some of those folks. On the other hand, our developers, right? So these are folks who are creating the product that ultimately you're managing the process around, and they live in a world of code, right? So the ideal here is to have code artifacts represent the process itself, right? Benefit here, of course, is it provides the developers the ability to have the DevOps process adhere to the same kind of standard code workflows that they use today. So you use your code editor that you like already. You don't have to learn a new tool to represent the process of your DevOps. You can check that code artifact into source code controls. You get versioning, you get history. You can compare different versions of your release process over time to diff them. You can even do best coding practices like pure code review. And that gets, all of those benefits get applied to the very process of building and releasing your software along with the actual software itself. So the notion here is that understanding these two skill sets, these two modes, lets you scale by basically building on top of the skills that your team already has. The second mode is more around kind of how do you respond to the different things that are happening in your process that are going to initiate or start different parts of the process. And we see in the organizations that we work with tends to be kind of two different big modes of triggering what's happening in the DevOps process. So in the first case, we have this really process-driven mode where things like we want this process to run whenever it's requested by the business owner, right? Or after a sprint demo, if the team gets together and approves this, right? So these are kinds of cases where they're regular processes that you still need to make repeatable, but they don't necessarily adhere to a precise schedule. There's no kind of programmatic monitoring that you can do for some sort of system event that will create these processes, right? So lots of triggers happen from that sort of thing. But then on the other side of the equation are these highly sort of event-driven kind of triggers, right? So every time a commit gets merged to the main branch, boom, you want to carry out some process that's going to bring that release through. Or maybe it's based on a schedule, right? You do your nightly build at the same time every night. You want to kick off and have this standardized process occur every time. These are really quite easy to do based on listening for these kind of code level events. So if you build a DevOps solution only around one mode or the other mode, you're going to miss out on an ability to scale because you create bottlenecks. Right? So if all you have implemented is a process-driven DevOps workflow, then you're going to be missing the opportunity to scale that by having some things happen automatically, right, based on events. Likewise, if you build a fully automated, code-driven pipeline that only works on these kind of code-level events, you're going to create a bottleneck where those manual steps that have to happen will interfere with the rhythm of those automated events, right? So we can achieve scale by having a process that can respond to both of these different drivers at the same time. So ultimately, this is what we want to do, is think about this matrix in our organization and say, all right, what process-driven triggers do we have, right? And in which cases should those be solved with a code-centric approach or a GUI-centric approach? Likewise, what are event-driven triggers? And then should we have GUI-centric and code-centric approaches to that as well? And by understanding where each of our triggers fit and where all of our team skills fit in this matrix, then that allows us to achieve much greater scale because we're leveraging our resources and we're being able to be flexible in terms of the types of events that are driving it. So by way of example, we're going to go now into a specific combination of tools. But bear in mind, the same sort of matrix of those factors, of those two different modes, can apply regardless of your tool. In our case, these two are quite interesting for us. These are two approaches, tools that fit together right here in Xebia Labs in our own organization. And they're both interesting because they both support this dual mode operation of GUI-centric and code-centric modes for operation. And they both have a sense of these dual mode triggering mechanisms. So Jenkins for continuous integration supports both the GUI and the Jenkins file, which is the sort of scripted pipeline. XL release, again, the orchestration, pipeline orchestration tool. We support both a rich GUI environment for modeling and executing pipelines, as well as a Groovy-based DSL way to capture the definition of those pipelines that you can still execute the releases. So when we pull these together, this allows us to combine those two products in a way that really supports all of these different potential combinations of modes. From purely GUI-centric, just with XL release tool, where you might have a team get together and decide that they want to model out a relatively manual process and have that triggered by relatively manual kickoffs or meetings, all the way up to completely kind of code-centric, event-driven pipeline that executes based on a continuous integration phase and kicks off a deployment. Now, bear in mind that in all of these cases, XL Release offers all those other things beyond just executing the events in the pipeline, the parts like reporting and auditing and notifications and communications with other folks on the team. So you'll see that in the demo. Also important to remember that these triggers go beyond just the doing of the stuff, right? So we're going to flip over to the demo, but as Vincent's getting his machine ready to do that, why don't we pop the final survey up here? So if you're kind of thinking about your own release process, what's your kind of feeling here of the developer maintaining scripts, right? Again, one of the challenges that we see in organizations is by scripting these things, it's relatively easy to get started, but it's also relatively difficult, ultimately, to scale. And maintaining those scripts over time can become quite a challenge for a lot of organizations that are fairly complex. So we've got some responses ticking in here. Okay, and it looks like the response is pretty heavy on the script. Okay, so a very small number, only 17%, are really saying that developers don't maintain scripts for any of this, and then the vast majority are somewhere north of that, and almost half or more than half, right? So basically, again, think about this as a potential bottleneck in your process, right? If the developers are doing scripts that are managing this entire release process, the maintainability and accessibility of that to other parts, other types of modes of operation and other people with different skill sets might be a challenge. So let's take a look at how you can do that. I'm going to turn it over to Vincent. He's going to walk you through a couple of those different modes, the GUI-centric and the code-centric and so forth.
Yes. Hi there, this is Vincent Partington. Happy to join Tim this webinar. So I'll start with the top right corner where we did code-centric, event-driven. So let's say I'm a developer and I make a code change. So let me start by showing you the app. So we have this demo app, which you might have seen before from us. And there's a text here, the third one from the top. Follow this link to get the tutorial, which is kind of an ugly text here. Should say click here to see the tutorial, something like that. So I'm going to change the code. So I have the HTML source code for this page. I'm going to change that text and say click here to read the tutorial.
So the developer has made this change in his own environment.
In his own environment, and it will now, so I'm playing the developer role now. Developer now will make that change, committed to source control, Git in this instance. And it's now in the SCM repository. And at that point, I haven't set it up here with triggers, but you could have Jenkins triggered automatically from here. So we're going to show you how you can actually get this built and also deployed and then promote it further. So what I've done, I've actually have this job here and I use a Jenkins file. So this is a pipeline definition for Jenkins. This will check out that code that I just did, just changed the project. We'll build it using Maven, a clean package there. We'll then use the new XL deploy plugin for Jenkins capability to be invoked from a Jenkins file to create a package, to publish that package to XL deploy, and then to deploy it to this environment. So that's my test environment, which is server 2, which is this one, the one that ends in 7012, server 2. So when I run that pipeline, it will actually build the app, create a package, and push it and deploy it. But that's not all it will do. It will also start a release, an actual release, that will then push that forward. So this is just the simplest thing you can do is actually these two stages here. Just create a package, deploy straight ahead. But this is a very simple thing. So that's good enough for test. Let's say for QA, we then do something more. We will have more control over that. So for that, we start a release. So there you have that part. That release is actually then already GUI driven. That's defined here. So this is what my release could look like. My release template in Extra release. So this will be deployed to the QA environment. Then it would run some performance tests, run some functional tests. These will be automated. Then it will be ask the QA team to do some exploratory testing. We know it's bad, but it still happens. And then store that for later purpose, store that version that we just deployed.
So in this case, this is similar. It's showing the different phases and the different tasks that are required for the process, but it's allowing somebody who's less technical, perhaps, to kind of model this out visually.
Indeed, exactly. So this could be edited by anybody. You could do manual testing, gates, all the standard things you do next release. So the way you can trigger it is actually, well, I didn't have a Git trigger on this. That messes up my demo, of course. So I just click build now. And it will now build the application. It took all of 2 seconds. It's a big application. Publish package is now deployed to my first environment, which is this one. So that already says click here to read the tutorial. And then I would go into Extra release and see all the running releases. This is the one I just created, 533. And it's now deploying to the QA environment. So run the performance and functional test. So I can actually first go here and see that it's deployed to the QA environment. And now actually this is the first time that humans will be involved. Because this is when the QA team would get a notification from Extra release to say, hey, it's time for you to do your exploratory tests. And they will get an email notification or whatever from Extra release, and then actually see that appear in their My Task screen. I don't see it there because I'm not in the QA team, but that's what they would see, and they could then go into the product and actually say, okay, they would of course first do the test, then they could either say, okay, the tests are totally, it failed the release and this thing would just stop here. That could be one thing they do. They could also say they skip it, which is not what we want them to do. Or they could say, okay, I've done it, so I've clicked around and found everything to be okay. So they're happy with it. And now we'll actually store that version. So this is actually what you can do on every trigger or every nightly build or merge. Get this pushed to the QA environment. But this is all event-driven. But with a combination of code-driven, code-centric, GUI-centric, manual, and automated all in a single flow. But then what say we want to do the process-driven approach? And so we do this every commit or whatever, but then Tuesday, it's time to actually push this thing to production. Okay, so then we go here and we have this promote to prod environment. This is the big one, as we do so often. This is the process-driven GUI-centric approach where we say, okay, we want to write a press release. Marketing has to do that. We need to send an email to the support team to let them know a new version is coming. We have a gate. We're ready to go. Then we actually deploy the app to the production environment, and then the marketing team then has to publish the release. So they want to make sure they're ready for it. So this is where I would actually start it straight from Extra release, and would actually go here and say new release. So this will be Tuesday release. So create that thing, start it, and it now got the latest version. I'll show that here. Got the latest version of Pet Clinic, the app we're deploying. from the system itself. So every time we do this event-driven release, we update that version. If it gets past that exploratory test stage, of course. So that's kind of the quality gate there. There's, of course, the automated quality gate, the manual quality gate. If it gets right up to the end, it will update that version. That's what we are retrieving here to make sure we can then deploy that onto production. There's also a little bit of a release train demo, but that's a different story, different webinar. So now this will be a task that the marketing team has to work on. So marketing team gets a notification, does their work, goes into here and says, press release, ready to go. We don't even wait for the support team, they just get an email, but here there's actually a gate. And okay, are we sure everybody's ready? The marketing team, the support team.
Have a meeting, you get everyone in the same room,
they exactly there and do that thing.
Sign their name.
And then, okay, let's rock and roll. Let's go. So I press this button, then this will actually now go out and a little too fast. This will actually pull up this thing, and this is a new feature we introduced in Extra Release 6.10 that allows you to define a release not just as a template, what you've been seeing so far, but actually as a code construct. So this will be sitting along with your code in your source control repository, and this is a Groovy-based DSL where you can describe your release. So this is the name of the release. It has the phases, so the same things you just saw in the user interface, phases, tasks, releases, and you can have anything here. So this is a very simple one. We say we have a manual task here, so this will be defined by the development team. And they know they always need to update the firewall. The network team has to update the firewall rules. This is not something that's maintained by the release management team, but by the development team that knows that this needs to be done. So they put this along with their code. This is here. Still a manual task, but now defined in a code-centric approach. And then, of course, there's an automated task, which is actually to deploy this application to the production environment, the third environment.
So the piece about this that is quite helpful, of course, is that the developers and the development team, they don't understand that greater process. They don't know about press releases. They don't care about support. They're focusing on what are the steps that are required to release their understanding of the world. They encapsulate it in a code artifact as they're writing it. The rest of the team doesn't have to wait for them. They know that it's always going to be available whenever that project gets built. So it's really kind of release in two different ways here. It's release from the software team's perspective as well as release from this broader organizational perspective. Yeah,
and I think that's actually the DevOps journey every company is. We've done it ourselves. We started with Excel Deploy back in the day, and that was just that thing, that just line 17 to 24. The actual putting the bits on a box, and then we figured, oh, we've solved this problem, and then we found out, wait a sec, there's more to this thing. And every time we do a release, this template gets bigger and bigger because then the marketing team and the support team and this whole thing, like all the things you need to do to really get it out there, becomes bigger. And this is just the part for development. So this is also where we started branching out, and then exactly.
And really, the development team doesn't need the visibility necessarily that everyone else does. So the release manager or the auditors or the security and risk professionals may want to have insight into the things that are happening later, but obviously they're not involved in the scripting.
Exactly. The nice thing, though, is that they can see what's going on. So this task ran, and it's basically pulled out this Groovy file.
So that's pointing to the Groovy file that you were just looking at in the source.
Indeed, and that actually caused a new release to be created, which is this one. So that's also cool. You have this thing as a code construct, but here it's visual like all the other releases. So the network team doesn't have to go into some code construct to actually see this, even though they might actually feel comfortable doing that. But they can just go in here and see, okay, I got this to do this firewall thing. So they will say, new firewall rules loaded. Press complete again, and then the next automated task will go to push this thing to the production environment, which is setting 7014, and then, oh, we're in the middle of the deployment now, and then I should of course wait it till it's done. It's done here, and it's done here, and then also here, and I close this. This is done, and now we're waiting for the marketing team to publish a press release, and we can say, okay, they of course get a notification again, they would go into the tool, see that they have to do this, and they will say PR pushed. It's not a pull request, a press release. Different terminologies. Boop, and they're done. Great. And then the whole release is done.
And of course, along the process, we're thinking about continuous improvement, right? So we're looking at ways that we can understand our DevOps process as we're scaling it to see, are we getting better and where are our bottlenecks?
Yeah, and this allows us to see that. So here we can see all the different releases that we just saw. So there's the first one, the one that happened on every commit, the Petfinik 310 to QA one, which is mostly automated. But then we see this one, that's actually the big one, choose the release one, where it could be that it's prepared release has for just 1 minute now. But it probably would take the marketing team more than 1 minute to write a press release.
They're good, but they're not that good.
Exactly. So you can see here where your bottlenecks are. So it could be that after you've released it, it would take them a day to publish it. That would be pretty annoying. So that might be something, hey, that's something we'd even automate. Like have that press release sit somewhere on the share, push it out to the website automatically, those kind of things. So that's very good.
And if we, and again, if we had a series of individual tools and no way to kind of orchestrate them all together, we wouldn't have that insight, right? So we would struggle when it came time to try to scale things because we wouldn't know what parts of the process needed to be improved.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so so I think that's great. Kind of perfect on hitting those different kind of parts of those different the different modes. So the code-centric, the GUI-centric, process-driven, event-driven. So so let me stop there. I know there's some questions that have been coming in. I want to leave time for some conversation there, but basically, there's really kind of two things that I want to emphasize here. The first one, obviously, is the notion of really scaling without orchestration is very hard to imagine, right? So that set of disconnected tools and techniques, even if individually they automate a part of the process, to really figure out how to truly scale in your organization, you have to be able to orchestrate across the entire release. And then the second part of that is we really have to think about, especially in an actual real-world organization that has a mixture of people and skill sets and modes of operation, if you're not set up to take advantage of those different combinations, you're really going to struggle to scale as well, right? Because you'll be trying to apply maybe one of those 4 modes to all sorts of tasks and all sorts of releases, and it doesn't really work that way. Obviously, the outcomes are some of the things we've already talked about, that enterprises that are doing this kind of release orchestration, we're seeing that overall they're having a great benefit in terms of the time to release software. Additionally, this allows you to remove bottlenecks, right? And you end up having better utilization of your resources because you can allow the developers to do what they're good at, focus on those kinds of things, and still support the needs and skills of the other folks on the team. And then this last one is the one that's really important for me, right? Is that, again, in the most simplistic world, you might be able to fully automate and orchestrate the entire thing. But in reality, we do see that most companies have these mixtures of environments, right? And the notion of a project might touch on multiple different systems that are being managed by multiple different teams with different skill levels. And you can only start to handle all of those kind of mixed delivery modes and environments if you apply these kinds of practices at scale, right? Great. So kind of right on schedule here, I'm going to flip back over to some of the chat and the questions here. If anybody has some questions, feel free to put them in the chat window. There's a couple in here that I'll start to pick out. Integrating as part of the Jenkins pipeline, I think we kind of covered there. So how about this notion of, someone asked, how do you manage cross-application dependencies? And then how do you dashboard and report on that? So Vincent, thoughts about dependencies and how you might handle those in our tools specifically, but in
yeah, actually, there's 2 ways in our tools to do that. One is that on the technical level, so you can actually have 2 applications next to deploy depend on one another. But there's also the one, and that means that if you deploy one, it will make sure the other one is also deployed automatically, and you can't undeploy the dependency without undeploy the other one. You can break applications that way. But there's also ways to actually have release processes depend on one another. So for example, actually that's what you saw here. There was a bigger one, started the smaller one, and waited until that was done before proceeding. That's actually two ways you could do
it. Yep, great. Got a question here. This one comes up, it seems almost every webinar we do, which is sort of what are the biggest challenges to continuous integration and continuous delivery. You know, from my perspective, it touches on some of the things that we've seen here today. You know, it is a cultural shift in organizations where you have to break down these barriers between multiple teams. In many organizations, the challenges come from that, of this feeling of giving up responsibility, you know, or you know, people who have in the past perhaps liked having that, being that kind of bottleneck or roadmap, but there's some cultural changes that have to come with that. So I think first and foremost is to have your organization understand that this is the best way to achieve those business outcomes, right? Then, of course, it becomes having the right sets of tools and practices that are going to leverage that, right? So how do you get the most out of the dev team as well as the operations team and all of those other groups? So sort of consistent with your feedback. So let's see. We do have a question about security. That does come up a lot. You know, how do you automate security requirements and validation of security requirements? So as you see here, we have kind of a flexible approach to what goes into that process and what you model in the process. The tasks that Vincent was showing were coming from lots of different things. There were gate tasks and manual tasks and deployment tasks. But you can have tasks that talk to all different kinds of systems. So you might have tasks that update JIRA tickets, or you might have tasks that you know, make some script execution. Likewise, security can be part of that process. So you could be going to an automated security static application, you know, Fortify, app scan kind of thing. We do have a lot of customers who will integrate those processes with third-party tools like Black Duck, or you know, some of these software analysis products. And all of that, it's kind of up to you to model that. So the way our process works is you're just creating these plugins that call out to those third-party systems. But then from there, it becomes just like any other task that's in the process. So a lot of flexibility there. Let's see, we've got a couple of questions in the window here. Okay, so interesting question here on when we have stages and tasks in both in a Jenkins file and in a release, sort of which is the master of the stages, right? So do you need two to keep in sync? You know, does one call the other? I'll let you answer, Vincent, but I think it's kind of both, right?
Both, yeah, actually, they both define their own stages. As you saw in the example, the stages are defined in the Jenkins file were mostly on the first part of your CD pipeline that was build, create the package, deploy to the test environment, and then kick off the rest of the stages. So actually, the last stage of Jenkins was actually, of the Jenkins file, was actually kicking off the stage in X release, and then we had the stages deploy QA, prepare the press release, deploy to prod, and then publish the press release. So it was kind of, they're basically two. Mm-hmm. You could concatenate them basically.
Yeah. And again, it tends to be based on those triggers, right? So the process-driven versus those code-centric or automatic or schedule-driven events will kind of determine what's the entry point for the process, right? Yeah. So automated, you know, your CI process with an automated build that gets triggered by your code commit, that might kick off the XL release process from Jenkins, right? So in that case, Jenkins is kind of the initiator, whereby that process-centric, hey, let's get everybody in the room and say we're ready to start the release process with some manual tasks. That might, when it gets to that deployment piece, might call out to Jenkins to say execute that pipeline. So it's those different modes.
It's an interesting one here. When should the performance test happen? Is it to be done in each build? Well, that's an interesting one. That's actually where you could tweak it. You could do that in each build, but it's probably going to be an expensive operation, especially if you spin up a cloud environment to do that. So that's where actually you would say that would be maybe, well, not on each build, but do this release train thing that you saw here, that we have each build updating this variable, and at the end, once a day or once a week or whenever, you actually pick up that latest version and then run the performance test on that. So you can actually do kind of have different levels of triggers, so one on each commit, and communicate further.
Okay. Another question here about, can XL release do basically what the asker describes as legacy stuff, right? So, OS builds, user ID creation, install, code deploys, backup, this kind of thing. So basically, the question writes, for more legacy infrastructure or physical builds that don't belong in in containerized environments. So I think there's a little bit of a combination here of both deployment stuff as well as release tasks. So that we didn't talk too much today about XL deploy, which is doing things like provisioning and actually moving the bits and doing the database.
Indeed. We didn't actually zoom into that because in here the XL deploy task was just a single task. We didn't even show the user interface. Yeah. Shame on me. But XL deploy is actually the product where you would do all this stuff. So there you would spin up environments, install middleware, deploy the app on top of that. So that would be a separate thing. So that's where you could put that. So.
Great. And then here, the question is around, can you report on the overall view of all of the components of an application, right? So your database, your web app, and the various versions, the changes made, and so forth. So again, I think that depends, right? Some of that can be at the deploy level. So being able to compare when you were doing your change in the pet shop, from deployment to deployment of that, you can know what changed. And be able to automate the rollback process. That becomes very important for responding to problems, right, is to be able to roll back. But then, of course, some of those things might exist outside of the product. So being able to see the specific code change, for example, your source code management is going to be able to do that.
Yeah, exactly. And actually, XL release allows you to pull that into the dashboard feature, of course, which we didn't show either.
Right. So again, beyond the scope of today's conversation about scale specifically, but we had a quick view of that in that summary at the end of the release where you saw how much time was spent on each phase. A major focus of XL release is to surface this insight through reports and dashboards. So for a running release, we can go into a release dashboard and see configure all kinds of views into it. What changes are happening from the back end and the SCM, what JIRA tickets are involved in that deployment, the overall change volume, all sorts of information like this. Okay, I think we probably maybe have time for one more. Yeah, so this is kind of what is the GUI-centric tool, and can a template of tasks be created, cloned, and modified to add or eliminate tasks for a particular release? So yeah, that's the tool that we were looking at today is from Xebia Labs XL Release, and in that the the tasks and the phases are all created in that GUI mode that you saw Vincent showing. Looks a little bit like a Kanban board, right? And that allows you to create all of the individual tasks that become sort of the template for that release. Once the release is running, depending on how you set up your permissions and the different users, they could customize this further. So maybe you can add tasks or configure it further in the release. So, and that does happen sometimes where perhaps a release, a template might model a standard process of readying, approving, and deploying some software, but maybe there are some additional steps that happen when it goes from kind of dev to QA versus QA to production. Maybe some compliance steps come in that case. So further being able to customize those templates based on the actual release becomes important as well. All of that is something that you can do right here in the GUI in XL Release. Okay. All right, one bonus, because this came in and it looks kind of interesting. We're coming up at the top of the hour, so we'll make this the last question. And I think we put the recordings of these sessions up online, and we're happy to interact. If folks have some questions, they can comment on that, and we'll get back to that as well. So the question here was, if you're setting up pipeline as code in Jenkins, what tool is suggested for the release orchestration part, right? So does XL Release do it? And can you integrate this with ITSM tools like ServiceNow? And so the answer to the latter part, can you integrate with something like ServiceNow? The answer is yes, which is why I do suggest it as the actual release orchestration tool. So the point of XL Release is it's an extensible way to create these plugins that talk to all of those other systems in your process. ServiceNow is one that we offer right out of the box, and you could update ServiceNow instances as a result of something that's happening in that process. And query them. Right? So the benefit of having XL Release that's kind of operating at a higher level than just the CI part is you can really talk to all of those different products that might be everywhere from your agile planning tool all the way to Google Analytics after you actually release your software and everything in between, and certainly including ServiceNow. Okay. So hope this was helpful for folks today in the conversation. Scalability and scaling DevOps across an enterprise is a really complex topic, and we hope that this specific slice of it, thinking about the different modes of user operations and the different kinds of events that you need to respond to, gives you some ideas of how to squeeze a little bit more out of your teams and your processes. But really, I encourage you to think about the overall journey that you're going in DevOps. You're going to have to scale in other ways as well as you go across your organization with different technologies. And hope that this has given you a start. And we're happy to continue the conversation if ZV Labs can be helpful with your journey that you're on yourself. So thanks, Vincent, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks, everybody, for taking the time. We hope it was helpful, and we'll talk to you on a future webinar.